Here.
Counselor Hickerson.
Here.
Counselor Zadi.
Here.
Counselor Hanson.
Here.
Counselor Batolo.
Here.
Counselor Robinson.
Here.
And Mayor Mickelson.
Here. Okay, with that, I will turn this over to Mr. Severud and our consultant from Barry Dunn.
Thanks, everybody, coming for this subsequent meeting. Lakita's going to present the project we've been working on for the past year. And I believe, our co-manager on this, Jason Gink's also on the call. So they're going to present, looks like 39 slides. Hopefully we can get through this and ask any questions. If I need to impart or you want to direct a question my way, feel free. But other than that, I'll let these guys have the stage. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, Mayor, members of council. It is truly a pleasure to be back before you, even though it's virtual, to present to you your strategic plan. We are excited about the needs assessment, the resource analysis, and the strategic plan process that we've been through. As JJ said, we do have 39 slides. Some of this information is a little repetitive because you have seen some during our previous presentation in October. We have Jason Gink that's joining us that kicked off this project, and he'll be also providing some additional insight on where do we go from here. So tonight we'll go through the executive summary, the resource analysis, the budget and funding analysis, as well as the conclusion. And of course, we have space and time for any questions as we continue to build a real living, breathable document for Rock Springs. As it relates to executive summary, the needs assessment and resource analysis strategic plan was built to serve the department as a roadmap. Not only the department, but you as council, providing clear direction for support for future and emphasizing measured and a responsible approach that aligns with long-term community goals. And the foundation of this approach was to incorporate an effective and efficient community engagement process. It was truly a pleasure between going out to the pop-up events, the events that we had within the facilities during their time frame, as well as the community survey. We received a lot of great feedback. Some of the key findings. We recognize that Parks and Recreation in the Central Park of Rock Springs has a significant overlap in service areas, but that provides a robust access for Central residents. Out of the 207 park components that were identified, only 20 scored below expectations. And that shows us generally good performance of all of your park amenities. When comparing your specific components to the National Recreation Parks Association benchmarks, Rock Springs meets the median in most categories, with sports fields, tennis courts, and community gardens being the exceptions. So we have a couple of identifiers there that we could probably work off of as we continue for programming. Since the 2012 master plan, the additions of Reagan Park and Arthur Park have improved services in West Rock Springs. However, due to its age and deferred maintenance, the Civic Center has several facility and infrastructure issues that have impacted access, safety, and security. As parks and infrastructure age, the department should review oversaturation of those components and shift resources to underserved areas of the city and reduce duplication where we can. And we'll give you a little bit more feedback on that. Well, not a little bit more. We'll give you more feedback on how we can accomplish this as we go through our presentation. We also looked at the cost recovery for the department. And the overall total cost recovery for the department had fluctuated between 2018 and 2024, with a low of 20% in 2020. Likely due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. By 2023, total cost recovery improved to a high of 24%. Golf had the highest cost recovery rates, consistently covering nearly half of its expenses. And in 2019 and 2021, the golf division had cost recovery rates above 50%. However, this did drop to 44% in 2022, before recovering to 48% in 2023. There's a little bit more information about that as we go through and talk about financial analysis later in the presentation. Jason?
Yeah, thank you, Lakita. And it is really an honor and a pleasure to be before Rock Springs Council again. And thank you so much for your leadership and your support of this project. As we look at our strategic initiatives, what our planning team does is that we look at, sort of the main focus areas for the future of Rock Springs. And we look at, from our overall analysis, what are the core areas of focus. And this helps give the director, the city, constituents, certainly staff, such as an orientation and training. It gives them clear guidance as to what we believe through this planning process should be the primary areas of focus into the immediate and near future. And the first one listed here, and I won't read all of it to you, but balancing resources and services with evolving interests. You, as a premier provider of parks and recreation and these great experiences, do so much for the Rock Springs community. You really are a beacon of wellness and opportunities for the community, and you get asked so much. The challenge is, how do you keep up with all that with your limited resources? And so we are encouraging staff to balance those resources and services to really sharpen that focus with the evolving interests of the community. And the next one, Lakita, please. Prioritizing equitable distribution and preservation of valued assets is another one. That's a lot to say, but really, Lakita touched on this earlier. It's that you do have a high concentration of components. And by the way, components could be anything from a playground to a tennis court to actually over 80 different amenities that the community might be interested in. You have a high concentration of those, and you had periods of time where you provided a tremendous amount of parks over a relatively short period of time. And those components exist in core areas of the community. We certainly don't encourage you to necessarily take those away, but as that infrastructure ages out and their time to replace, as well as changes in the community interests occur, we encourage you to look at a distribution of how those assets and those components exist throughout your system, to do so in a way that is really just balanced. Because again, you can't do everything for everyone, but how do you set that course for a sustainable future around financial and capital assets? Go ahead, Lakita, next one. And so really, go ahead, Lakita. I heard some feedback, I apologize. No? Okay, sorry about that, folks. So going back to the equitable distribution and preservation of assets, a couple more areas of clarity. We are encouraging the quality over quantity approach. And what we really mean by that is to say, you guys have been so responsive. Council, staff, the community, you've been so responsive to the community needs. You've done a really fantastic job. We do have recommendations around the quantity. I mean, how can you commit to providing so many of these current and future assets and be able to sustain those into the future? Your financial resources and your capital program, we're well aware that the city is updating and going through a great process citywide around capital considerations and planning for the future. We certainly encourage staff to look at the recommendations we've provided and fold those into the overall capital program and planning efforts across the city. Lakita, the next one. And then on the build foundation of success, this is the other strategic initiatives that we wanted to mention. Here again, staff has been working incredibly hard along with volunteers and partners and certainly council and whatnot. Yet, taking that time, you've been in such a boom mode of creating all these parks and facilities and these great provision of services, and you've gone through transition. You have a succession plan with a new executive director. By the way, kudos for having that mapped out to your team. It's really, I think, a great succession is certainly a great way to sustain and improve services in our experience. But at any rate, the foundation for success is all about sort of giving staff and the opportunity to sort of breathe and really make sure things like training and development and staff retention are paramount, because of course these public services are provided through our staff that provide these services, as well as things like equipment and access technology. We do believe there's a fairly significant opportunity for the team to take a little bit of a step back in a way to resharpen that focus on training and retention, particularly when there's an executive transition occurring like your director.
Thank you, Jason. And so as we looked at all of the information from the key findings, the community engagement, and identified what would be our recommended strategic priorities, we developed the 5-year implementation plan. And again, I won't read this entire slide to you. I know that JJ, thank you, JJ, has provided you with the presentation. And we also have the companion document that I'll share with you just via tonight so that you can see where the document has evolved. But for the 5-year implementation timeline for your plan, is the first year is to focus on the foundation and immediate needs. That is the ADA compliancy and accessibility, the facility operations and maintenance. Your team does a phenomenal job with the inspections and things that they do now, but we want to continue to expound upon that and incorporate that preventive maintenance into a schedule that aligns with your capital improvement planning. Funding and financial sustainability, applying for grants. JJ has done a phenomenal job and has received more than, if I'm not mistaken, $1 million in grants for capital improvements and projects throughout. Continuing that trend will allow us, or allow Rock Springs, to continue to add to the amenities. Program development and workforce development. So in our first year, building off the foundation for the immediate needs. In that second year, strengthening operations. Focus areas being implementation of initial projects and partnerships. Within the document, you'll also get the opportunity to see where we've identified the current partners, and we make recommendations for expanding those partnerships with the school system, with the local community college, as well as with tourism and visitors. When we look at year 2 and strengthening those operations, it includes the continuing work with ADA compliance, facility operations, funding, and getting more into community engagement, as I talked about, building those strong partnerships, and then launching ecotourism and conservation education programs. As a part of our process, we did benchmarking, looked at the state as well as the local communities that surround your beautiful city, and we found that there are great opportunities for ecotourism and conservation. Year 3.
Hey, Lakita,
Yes.
if you don't mind, on year 2, if you don't mind, just I want to interject something here.
Please.
On the facility operations and maintenance, you will have a series of recommendations on stemming from the facilities assessment, which certainly was a portion of the services we provided to review your full operations and services. And so you're seeing year 2 here, for example, the structural assessment for the Civic Center. You talk about a beloved facility that is highly utilized. We had an awesome opportunity to talk to so many facility users and really enjoyed that time with your community. You talk about a beloved facility with some historical significance and a lot of really cool stuff happening at the same time. We know on the Civic Center, as an example, there's going to be very significant decision points for future investments. And so you're looking at, by year 2, completing that structural assessment. We hesitate in year 2 to look at launching major investments for capital improvement at the Civic Center, but we do really want to focus on that structural assessment just to make sure any dollars invested into the Civic Center are ones that are financially responsible from the standpoint of making sure you get a good return on your investment without any risk to the structure. Thank you, Lakita.
No, thank you, Jason. I think that was important for us to stop at that point to share. And when we're getting to year 3, scaling those improvements, looking at that mid-scale projects and expanded programs. The facility development includes that comprehensive capital improvement plan for parks, trails, and facilities. Workforce development, as Jason stated, while you have done a phenomenal job with identifying and moving forward with succession, building off of this succession by creating continued opportunities with leadership and building off of the information that we've gathered to really look at jobs as well as equity and compensation. Again, we're looking in this year and looking at environmental sustainability and how can Spark technology help us in facility management. In year 4, the large-scale projects will begin. See, the department has already started discussions. As you'll see here, we talk about a large-scale project, the potential of what does an indoor multi-sport athletic facility look like? We recommend looking at it from a feasibility study lens. And conversations have already been started with tourism and the Visitors Bureau to what does that look like? What does that feasibility study look like so that we can get that true information from where the citizens see this facility or that type of facility going. Again, continuing funding and financial sustainability, reaching higher and documenting those practices that we've had in place over the last 3 years by assembling the team for our CAPRA, which is the Commission on Accreditation for Parks and Recreation Agencies, building a team to move forward with that. And then going into our 5th year of implementation, achieving strategic goals. And that's where the completion of critical projects and alignments with the best practices from the facility development, the accreditation, the continued workforce development, and then evaluating how energy savings from smart technology and sustainable practices can assist us as we're looking at our long-term efficiency for energy at our facilities. And that concludes the first portion of our presentation. And if you would like for me to pause here, Mayor, for any questions, we can do so.
Council?
Your Mayor?
Yes, sir.
On the Civic Center, have you seen towns like Rock Springs have the same issue? And is there grant opportunities? And where are those grant opportunities at?
Yes, sir. We have seen, and Jason, you can definitely jump in, where there have been facilities that unfortunately, due to deferred maintenance issues and use, that there are recommendations that come forth, and how do we address those issues? And that's where the assessment, we feel, really would give you the true view of the cost and the extent of the damages that are still in that space. Jason?
Yeah, and I appreciate that question. And I know it's such an important question because of the long history of the Civic Center and the great benefits it provides. And based on our facility assessment, you know, we worked with an engineer firm to do the facility assessment. We're aware that there are significant needs for improvement at the facility, but we want to make sure that we fully understand if the city decides to make any investment, what really is that potential risk and return on investment for improvements to the facility. And to answer your question, what are there other similar communities? And yes, as a consultant, but also as a, I was a 30-year director in the field too, and I had organizations that went through this exact same scenario with deferred maintenance of long-standing buildings that had such significance in the community. And it's important to take that step back and do the financial analysis. Rock Springs, just like any other city, is limited on their capital opportunities, and to be thoughtful about how those are being invested is really important, because, you know, last thing we want to do as consultants is give you recommendations to invest heavily into any facility, come to find out that, you know, it's not structurally sound or something like that. I think you asked about grant and opportunities there. Absolutely there is. Now, a lot of those grants, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but from my experience, those grants will require certain studies done ahead of time, because outside funding will also want to make sure that those dollars are being put into a facility or service that's structurally sound, so that they can be confident also in celebrating their investments from a granting standpoint. Beyond granting, we've also seen things like partnerships. For instance, other organizations take on the use or operations of the facility, and by the way, we've also seen major capital investments to revitalize, historic and long-standing facilities too. It's just a matter of ultimately where does the city, through our analysis and through the other capital efforts that are going along citywide, where are those best benefits and investments to be made?
Your Honor.
Yes.
One more question, although it may be unpopular. Could there be renovations made to our rec center to incorporate what the Civic Center offers. For example, I know that it's a walk-in facility without having to go downstairs for people with issues going up and downstairs. Has that been considered, or should we consider that?
Yeah, and I want to just make sure I heard the question. Would someone please repeat the question? That broke up just a little bit.
Councilor Batolo.
Yeah, if you could please repeat it, that'd be great.
Councilor Batolo was wondering if it would be prudent for us to look at making structural changes to the rec center to make it as functional to the population that uses the Civic Center as the Civic Center is.
Okay, so let me repeat that. I think what I heard is that, would it be a recommendation to make improvements at the Family Rec Center for a variety of reasons, to include consideration of what those activities are taking place at the Civic Center? Is that what I heard?
Correct.
Correct.
Yes, the answer would be yes. Certainly, we have recommendations hand in hand with our engineering firm for some improvements already for the Family Rec Center to make that facility more functionable and more flexible, I should say, for spaces to handle many other types of activities, and to increase cost recovery and reduce the financial commitments as far as tax funding commitments from the city. But yes, and we've definitely seen that model done in other communities where you have aging infrastructure and you want to reinvest to make sure that those activities can happen, offset some of the services through taxes and other types of things to reduce that ongoing financial risk and commitment from the city. Yeah, you absolutely could go that direction to look at modifications of the Family Rec Center or another partnered facility to provide spaces that would accommodate for activities that are currently occurring at the Civic Center. Yes.
Any further comments or questions? Okay, it looks like we're good to go.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you, Jason. Now we'll get into the resource analysis, starting off with the inventory and assessment of facilities. And to organize Rock Springs public open space facilities for inventory, park areas were classified. As you see here, we classified the facilities, the number of facilities within that classification. And in this blue box here, you'll see where we utilize a size for acreage for those categories of your playground, neighborhood, community, and special use parks. When we looked at your level of services, you have a very strong level of services. The assessment helps us identify gaps in the service area. We talked a little bit about this when we first talked about the findings. And while we recognize that there are a lot of facilities within the core area where it's mostly populated, we do understand that there may be opportunities to look at some of those components and make some combinations of facilities for uses within the outdoor facilities. We have included a map of facilities that illustrates the concentration of those facilities, as I just spoke of. As you see here, the concentration in the central part, which there are some significant overlaps in those service areas, but it does ensure that there is access for the citizens. Now, while we may see less coverage in some of the other areas, we recognize that those areas are also less populated than the areas that have been identified where we have the most of the components. Key findings from this, as we shared, is that we feel that the service areas and alternative providers, the department offers a high level of services through parks and component provisions. The parks and infrastructure age do show that there is some oversaturation. So as we recommended early on, shifting resources to some of the underserved areas, not all resources, but as we look at those components, as Jason gave examples of those, where can some of those components go if needed? Now we'll get into the facility assessments. We talked a little bit about the Civic Center, and I gave you guys a presentation previously in October, along with our with our engineers. And I do recognize that there was some loss in sound during that time. So please feel free to ask us any questions as I go through these remainder of the slides for facilities. In addition, as a part of our project for Rock Springs, we have provided it's about 167 pages that Winters Griffin did provide for the facility, prioritizing the various components to include the importance of ADA, as well as other items that we are working through with JJ to make sure that we've covered. As we looked at the overall facility assessments, what we're looking for, we were looking to determine the condition of the buildings, identify any significant code deficiencies, and recommend actions as well as prioritize. At the Family Recreation Center, some of the follow-up items that we did identify, we looked at the parking lot, the boiler needs, the roof, and these are things that JJ and I have discussed, and these were things that were also identified in previous plans, but we wanted to make sure that we continued by also demonstrating, and we have several pictures that were also added. We look at the Civic Center, and I did have this slide up while Jason was discussing the options, and as we look at the overall future of the facility. Here again is information that you have seen before, as we talked about the systems, the HVAC systems, the plumbing systems, as well as the poor ADA compliance. But these are also some low-hanging fruit things, as you noticed, as we talked about in the beginning. Some of these things can be rectified without a large expense. We also had them look at the White Mountain Golf Course, and the golf course clubhouse has been well maintained, but there is a need for major renovations to extend the life of the facility. As you see here, we have identified the plumbing lines that have deteriorated, as well as locker room needs and additional needs. The Wataha Recreational Complex Stadium building was also included, and it is a beautiful facility. It was truly a joy to be there for the co-ed softball, the high school tournaments. The facility is a phenomenal gathering place for families, and it's multi-generational. And you see here that there were some additional items that were identified for correcting as it relates to the sidewalk and signs for some of the structure that we want to recommend to get continued assessment. Going back to what Jason stated earlier, long-term planning and investment. As you guys are embarking upon your first capital improvement plan throughout the community, looking how can we phase these renovations to address some of the major facility deficiencies while managing the costs. And again, exploring those grant opportunities as well as public-private partnerships. Within the plan, I have identified other options and opportunities that JJ may be able to look at along with the overall city, where there are crowdfunding options, sponsorship opportunities. We do believe that there are some opportunities for additional funding. And we go into our final section for this evening, and that was the budget and financial analysis. You did see this information previously as well, as we talked about the overall budget that the department receives and where it sits in the benchmarking for the National Parks and Recreation Association. It sits between the lower and medium quartiles for the operating budget for similar sized agencies. The agency, as you see, we know is divided in 4 different funds for its general fund. And the funding trend is in line with agencies serving populations similar to the size of Rock Springs. We delved a little deeper than our previous presentation, where we want to talk a little bit more about the financial overview and the net expenditures and the total subsidy. And here's where we'll get into that analysis. General observations across the overall facilities. As you see here, the blue line is parks. As we discussed in our previous presentation, parks within your department is not set up to receive fees. So we did not have the expectations, large fees, excuse me, for there to be a lot of revenue across parks. We have the gray line for Civic Center, the goal line for Family Recreation Center and golf being orange. All of the facilities do operate at a loss, which is something normal for departments in Parks and Recreation. We're not usually large revenue bringers. However, we do identify ways to bring in revenue, and we have identified some strategies for Rock Springs. But we did see revenue growth at the Wataha Complex and Golf Center, as well as the Family Recreation Center. We recognize that COVID did have an impact, as we saw in various communities. And we do recognize that the operating costs are steadily increasing. So we want to identify ways that we can recover costs. So we talked about increasing revenues through optimizing pricing and expanding services. One of the things that we've looked at is how can we maximize the time frame that the facilities are open, and how can we maximize rentals as well. Reducing operational efficiencies, exploring more public-private partnerships, and evaluating the opportunity to even expand and reduce hours depending on the facilities and the current rate of attendance. And researching and expanding varying fee rates, especially in golf, such as prime times, weekends, off-season, at levels that are at the market comparable in Wyoming. We have identified cost recovery strategies with Corey Central, important and value added. I did share this information previously. We looked at it at our October meeting, but we have identified programs that we feel can go into these areas. When we look at the Corey Central programs, we identified those programs working along with staff that are youth development, family oriented, as well as your aquatics programs. We feel that these level of programs are usually subsidized more and at the highest level of subsidy, but they are part of the mission and serves the majority of the community. Then we go to that next subsidy, as we should offer this, and there's some level that should be offered there towards that, and the important, as well as value added, which would receive less of a subsidy if we continue with this strategy. When we looked at the levels of staffing, we do recognize that the Rock Springs team is within the lower quartile to the upper quartile for the population. However, we do have recommendations for scaling the department's supervision, as well as identifying some opportunities for staffing. And those are things that JJ and I are currently working through, but we feel confident that we have identified within the current staffing and for future growth, a way that we can address that within the strategic plan. And as we go through our last slide, this is the fun part, right? It's like, Lakita, Jason, you come in our community, you tell us all these great things. How much is this stuff gonna cost? Well, we have cost estimates based off the milestones, based off your community and national trends for some of the things that we've identified. This is included within your packet, so I won't read through all of these items for you. But as you see, each year we've identified, based off of the strategic planning initiatives, where these things could lie within your budget. And then when we look at it from totals, the low estimate for implementing this plan over the next 5 years could be between 8 to 14 million, based off of the priorities and funding that has been identified within your teams. We do want to make sure that this is an estimate that we share with you, but it is based off of cost variations. Estimates depend on regional labor and costs. We recognize that funding sources fluctuate as well. And how do we prioritize the facility renovations and the trail expansions? Those things will lead to what that overall cost will be. And then we look at contingency planning for project budgets. So we are excited that we have made it to this point where we've identified where can we go, how do we get there, and now this is how much the potential cost is associated. And as policymakers and the leaders of the community, we know that it's important for you to see all of this information. And so that concludes what I have for you with our presentation. And I stop here for any questions. And Jason, is there anything that you want to add with any of the information that I've shared, or you want to speak to this slide as we move forward for questions?
Look, if you don't mind going back to the should do, must do, nice to do slide, I think that, when you look at cost recovery strategies, and, other slides indicated things about where you're trending on subsidizing, the department. And we know that while some of your revenues have increased, your overall subsidies have also increased, meaning it's tough to keep up with those ongoing costs. Certainly one takeaway from a strategic standpoint is, how long can you sustain that? How long can you sustain that increase subsidy allocated to Parks and Recreation while also, knowing all these capital needs that are out there? And I'm not trying to say gloom and doom. I think it's really helpful to know what these true costs are. And Lakita indicated those as a range. But why I brought up this slide again is, and I really like to say this in strategic planning, I think our team and your staff team did a great job on comprehensive engagement and analysis with the community, learning a lot. And I always say it's not only important to notice what's here as a high priority from the community, it's also important to notice what's not even listed. Because, that I say that, that good idea truck pulls up every day and kind of unloads all these great ideas the way that I say it. And you guys are do such a responsive job for the community. You offer and offer and offer. But like I said, to stay focused on your strategy, it's equally important to understand what those high priorities are that have been voiced from your community and from constituents and from staff, and as well as things that are not listed or things that are listed as a low priority, because there will come a point, and I think that point is now, to make those decisions as to what is a benefit to the community at the highest level and what can be done by a partner or a non-city organization to really make sure your long-term infrastructure can be financially sustainable. Thanks, Lakita. I appreciate the opportunity to add that.
Definitely. Thank you.
Council?
Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
On the estimated costs, as we go further down the line to 27, 28, 29, are those estimated costs including any anticipated inflation?
As I stated, the cost for inflation is that's a variable that is somewhat difficult. However, it does include the current cost, and there is probably about a 5% increase that was added to incorporate for some inflation. But with the changes in dynamics of construction, that is the hardest number to really put your finger on. Jason?
Yeah, I'd say, the recommendation there, and I'd go to the previous slide actually, is that overall, because we're talking out even, further out years and these types of things, and you're seeing some very large numbers there. Key infrastructure projects completed, such as athletic fields or multi-use trails, up to $6 million. We are recommending 10% to 20% plus contingency, just because of the timing of those. Now, of course, we don't necessarily know how those are going to be funded, meaning that this doesn't necessarily say, of course, the city's going to pay this exact cost. JJ, for example, has done a great job of getting grants. That cost could be, 80% grants, 20% city, that sort of thing. But to your question about these costs, we do recommend adding that contingency for planning for whenever these projects might occur in particular years.
All right, thank you.
Council? Okay. Well, I think you've given us a lot of information and a lot to think about, and we look forward to seeing this work continue as JJ and his team comes up with a really detailed plan to extricate ourselves from the conundrum.
Yes, sir. Well, and I will close in saying, and sure, Jason may want to add, but on behalf of the Barry Gunn team, this has been a phenomenal experience. The opportunity to work and serve with JJ, this is, I feel, the beginning of a long-term relationship as we work with you to continue to navigate as we implement. So thank you again this evening, and happy holidays to everyone as you go out on your breaks.
Thank you all for your work. We certainly appreciate it. Okay. So with that, we are adjourned until our regular meeting at 7 p.m.